For centuries, the Louvre was the palace of the kings of France. This is what it looked like in about 1860, when Napoleon III completed it. The entire Tuileries wing was destroyed in 1871. Otherwise, the Louvre has not changed since 1860. During the preceding 6 centuries, however, it underwent constant transformation. In the 14th century, King Charles V enlarged the ancient dungeon his forebear, Philippe Auguste, had built in 1200. This is how the Louvre looked under Charles V. In a painting by the anonymous 15th century artist of the Parliament of Paris, Altarpiece. The picture was clearly designed as a celebration of the French royal line. Christ is represented between Charlemagne and France's great medieval king, Saint Louis. As one reign followed the other, more buildings went up. Louis XIV completed the square court and built the colonnade that bounds the Louvre on the east. In the meantime, the ancient dungeon had been destroyed. For several centuries before Louis XIV, the Louvre had stood beside the western boundary of Paris. Beyond that came country and a horse fair. During the 18th and especially the 19th century, Paris spread rapidly towards the west, with the result that the Louvre, once a fortress protecting that side of the city, is now right in the center of Paris. We will now go into the museum itself. In the very first rooms, there is a masterpiece, the Avignon Pietà, painted by Enguerrand Quarton around 1450.
Its gold background recalls the earliest principles of Byzantine art, where gold stood for the abstract space of divine action, neither place nor space itself, unless it be heaven. This background was habitually the source of all light, but here, unexpectedly, real daylight has replaced it, bathing all the figures. The donor, St. John, the Virgin, and the Magdalene. Christ's body creates an almost tangible arc over his mother's knees. Modeled within that unique light, forms take on a specific density. What a Gothic artist would have expressed by means of line alone, Quarton conveys by volume. The figures represented here have the solidity of real life. There is no ground beneath them, nor sky behind them, but they are so fully rounded out they have a statue-like presence. Notice how sharply delineated and expressively modelled the donors' face is. The voluminous folds in the draperies help to weight the figures down. This perfect balance is offset by the Virgin's downcast face. Its emaciated look, filled with suffering, strikes a tragic note in this solid-seeming world. Her face is fixed in a mask of despair above Christ's body, whose all too perfect, arc-like form is dramatically broken by the all too perfect straightness of his fallen arm. The painting also contains a detail to be found nowhere else. As St. John gently removes the crown of thorns from Christ's brow, his fingers pluck the halo's golden rays like the strings of a harp. Time has been suspended in this limpid air, and the most poignant instant in the New Testament, the culmination of the tragedy, the furthest point in the Christian imagination, has been set down forever. One may get some idea of how new the style of the Avignon Pietà was by comparing it with another Pietà painted some 50 years earlier by Jean Malouel, a Burgundian who strikes a typically French note. That particularly French note also characterizes the female donor presented by the Magdalene, a painting by Jean A, known as the master of Moulins. A Flemish influence can be seen in the solidly modelled forms and yet there is a subtle harmony on the verge of dissonance that is altogether French. In this portrait of Jouvenel des Ursins, painted around 1460 by Jean Fouquet, one finds the purest expression of a national art form that has its roots in manuscript illumination. Fouquet's genius can be seen in the masterly composition and powerfully rendered forms. While his modernness is exemplified by the Renaissance-like background he has chosen for his subject, who was then Chancellor of France.
In Northern Europe of the 15th century, Flanders became the home of great art, particularly the rich trading centres of Bruges and Ghent. They belonged to the Duke of Burgundy, whose court outshone the court of the kings of France, which had been impoverished by the 100 Years' War. This castle in Ghent belonged to the Counts of Flanders, then to the Dukes of Burgundy. Jan van Eyck painted this portrait of the Chancellor, the Duke of Burgundy, around 1435.
The way of looking at the world has clearly changed here. Theological concerns or questions of hierarchy no longer dictate the form images are given. Both the figures and the space have been realistically rendered in this famous portrait. The composition maintains a subtle balance between the Virgin and the donor. The Virgin does not have to be shown as larger than the donor in order to be recognized as the Virgin. Lifelike limbs can be made out beneath the heavy draperies, which help as they touch the ground to accentuate the figure's solidity. Rollin's features have a true individuality. He is no longer a symbol, but a human being made up of clearly defined volumes. Every detail on every object has been depicted with scrupulous exactness. The composition is held together by the way light is used to create shadow inside the loggia and a powerful brightness extending over the countryside. Similarly, the closed space is contrasted with the openness of the country. The latter contains a kind of summary of the visible world, with river and plains, towns, fields, hills, and on the horizon, the Alps. Reflections lend added reality to the water. All the effects of light, from the window to as far as the horizon, have been suggested by nuances of color. This is how aerial perspective was introduced, bringing atmospheric effect into painting for the first time. Flemish and later Dutch art was long influenced by Van Eyck's understanding of light. In comparison, Roger van der Weyden's Annunciation seems rather archaic. Though painted at the same time as the Van Eyck picture, it does not have the former's clear command of space, but rather a series of separate spaces linked together. And yet, by using multiple perspective, the painter has clearly set out to give an impression of three-dimensional reality. Though slender, the Virgin is eminently real. The objects surrounding her are depicted with an almost affectionate care. A Gothic heritage can still be felt a whole generation later in the work of Memling. The elegance of the Virgin's outline recalls an art based on linear eloquence. But Memling's keen sense of realism comes through in his portrait of the old woman. One further echo of the greatness of Gothic art is still perceptible in Dirk Boots's Lamentation of Christ. The strong sense of drama brings it close to expressionism. In Bosch's Ship of Fools, faces are caricatured and bodies brutally deformed. Light throws the thick paint into relief, revealing a marked freeness of technique. Up until then, artists had been at pains to hide their individual techniques. All the madness of earthly existence is represented here.
In 1495, Charles VIII, King of France, was at war with Italy. Having captured Milan and Florence, He was impressed by the pleasant luxury in which the Renaissance princes lived. Not in dismal fortified castles like himself, but in palaces, in villas such as this one, decorated by the greatest artists. The Louvre now owns the frescoes by Botticelli, which once decorated the Villa Lemmi in Florence. But the art of San Gimignano did not appeal to the French princes. So Italian works of the Middle Ages and early Renaissance came later to the Louvre and not through the royal collection. Painted around 1270, Cimabue's Virgin in Majesty measures 4 meters in height and is the oldest painting in the Louvre.
It is a perfect example of how Byzantine art still dominated Italian painting of the period. Faces have no real individuality. While drapery folds fulfill a purely ornamental function, and no attempt is made at suggesting fullness of volume. The Virgin appears almost weightless on her open-work throne. Line and gesture alone occupy the picture surface.
Giotto's St. Francis of Assisi.
Painted shortly after Cimabue's Virgin in about 1295, Giotto's St. Francis of Assisi ushers in a wholly new vision. St. Francis fills out the space he occupies with such volumetric fullness, one can almost feel the weight of his body. As in Gothic sculpture, feeling is conveyed by face and gesture. Here, painting becomes a way not of repeating conventional imagery, but of expressing real life. The 6 wings would no doubt have surprised Giotto's contemporaries less than the strikingly realistic figure of St. Francis. Giotto was the first of the great Florentine innovators to communicate a restless intellectual quest through painting.
Pisanello's Ginevra d'Este.
Painted around 1436, the portrait's clearly incised outlines remind one that the artist also made medals. His flowers and butterflies have been painted above all to appeal to a taste for decorated surface, and also to show a complex arabesque of lines to its best advantage. Note how the curiously prominent hairstyle is counterbalanced by the line of the right shoulder.
Angelico's Coronation of the Virgin.
Was painted in Florence around 1430. At first one is struck by its gracefulness, its eternally young figures, and the delightful contrast of real azure blue and pink. Areas of shadow bring out the perfect purity of the halo-encircled faces. Yet the artist also sought to suggest a particular vision of space, created by the figures and their precisely folded draperies. While the throne is still Gothic in spirit, the perspective is noticeably more modern. The dais provides a monumental base for the figures, and steps add to the Virgin's stature, without taking anything away from the realism of the scene.
Filippo Lippi's Virgin surrounded by Saint Frediano and Saint Augustine.
One can feel the Renaissance approaching. The deliberately planned intervals between the figures is what creates space here, while volume is carved out by the play of light. The halos have been flattened to fit in with perspective. And even the background has changed, with the Madonna and Child placed in a niche. This reflects not only the change in architectural style, but also the new interest in geometry.
The Rout of San Romano.
Painted by Paolo Uccello in Florence around 1450, is marked by a taste for geometry rather than war. The composition is dominated by lances pointed in every direction, raised, lowered, or crossed. Their general direction suddenly veers to the left. The whole process is rather like watching an abstract movie where rectilinear images are accompanied by a rhythmical clicking. Like the lances, the horses create all kinds of perspective. They are shown from behind and from 3/4 on. Their parallel hooves appear to keep them in silent suspension. One will search in vain for any gloss on their coats, for that kind of observation had no interest for Uccello. Geometry dominates the checkered war flags too, and the complex, extravagantly plumed headgear. Uccello has set out not to describe reality, but to force it into the geometric patterns he loved, thus creating a world that might have come straight from a textbook on perspective. His determination has something heroic about it. There is scarcely any sky to be seen. On what ground there is has been neatly grouped into clumps of turf. A hallucinatory logic has taken over, paring down each form to play a specific part in the whole.
This portrait of Sigismondo Malatesta,
executed by Piero della Francesca around 1451, has a profile drawn with the same incisiveness as Pisanello's on a near black, empty background. Whatever is not absolutely essential to the portrait is reduced to purely geometrical form. The hair is treated as an element of mass, the neck becomes a cylinder, and the doublet pure volume. But each individual feature, the tightly closed lips and forcefully jutting nose, fits into the strictly measured whole. It is interesting to compare this portrait with another painted by Antonello da Messina in 1475. Note the use of chiaroscuro in the modelling and also the influence of Flemish art. In Giovanni Bellini's Christ Blessing, painted in Venice around 1460, one is struck by the marks of suffering on the face, the blood on the stigmata, and the lifeless gestures of the hands. Even the sky partakes in the emotion expressed. Some clouds float at exactly the level of Christ's tear-reddened eyes. The low-lying horizon and abruptly downward-leading perspective draw attention to the landscape and the huge sky spread behind Christ. Here one may detect the very first glimmerings of what, in art history, came to be known as Venetian light. The whole composition of Andrea Mantegna's Calvary is centered on Christ's body. The artist has gone to considerable lengths to suggest the third dimension by using the flagstones on which the crosses have been erected to create lines leading to a vanishing point. Obsessively interested in antiquity, Mantegna ensured that the costumes and arms of his Roman soldiers were authentic. Mantegna has also succeeded in creating a sense of depth by means of curving lines. The harshly delineated faces recall the features of certain sculptures. Yet one is conscious above all of the richness of the colours, which end, curiously enough, by prevailing over this tragic scene.
As entranced as his predecessors by Italian art, François I brought one of the period's great geniuses, Leonardo da Vinci, to France. It was in this manor house, beside the royal palace at Amboise, that the artist lived from 1516 to his death in 1519.
Leonardo is both famous and a mystery. He upset all kinds of accepted notions, first of all by looking at nature with a fresh eye. Then, in painting, by inventing a new concept of light. The Virgin of the Rocks contains such a rich luminosity that the division between light and shade is dissolved. In Leonardo's paintings, the very air takes on added density. In the Mona Lisa, for example, light has been suggested by contrasting areas of brightness with areas of shadow, while the background of the Madonna and Child with St. Anne consists entirely of the same shade of blue. From now on, the pure Quattrocento light of Piero della Francesca and Fra Angelico will seem to other painters too unreal to use. Leonardo changed not only the effects of light, but those of movement as well. The head here is not shown exactly full face, nor the shoulders from exactly 3/4. A small change in the way the shadows have been graded has also necessitated changing the age-old ritual of representing figures either full face or in profile. In the Madonna and Child with St. Anne, movement is indicated by means of the figures, by the way they hold their heads, or where their arms or eyes are directed. Space becomes a kind of scroll here, inscribed not only with the figures, but the lines of the landscape. The foreground of the Virgin of the Rocks is filled with the most perfectly depicted mass of plants. Then come the rocks, which open in two places, as if a single horizon were not sufficient for Leonardo. But in the luminous area beneath the stone arches, everything is different. There is no plant life beyond the grotto, and beyond the water, only mountains and stones. No living thing as far as the eye can see, simply stretches of water, fjords, and boulders. In the Madonna and Child with St. Anne, the stony waste has crept into the foreground. Leonardo is in the process of self-discovery and has given himself up to his dreams. They are desolate dreams of total emptiness. The famous smiles simply lure the spectator to follow Leonardo into his fantasies. Not of a better world, but of the end of the world. Leonardo's immense artistry and intelligence led him to this conclusion. And yet he had absorbed everything his predecessors could teach him. One could still sense the precise Florentine draftsmanship beneath the modelling of the hand in the Virgin of the Rocks. Drawing brought out all Leonardo's prodigious intelligence. He used his knowledge and skill to deepen his understanding of nature and the visible world. And he brought a new concept of space into art. He also altered the relationship between figures and their setting. The Mona Lisa, for instance, is more closely linked to the air in which she is represented. Beyond that, there is also a notion of time, even of the history of the universe. For this figure floating between landscape and sky comes from deep within Leonardo's dreams.
The School of Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau, the royal palace where François I was born. This is the gallery built and decorated for him. Throughout the 16th century, François and subsequent monarchs drew Italian artists to their court. Their work deeply influenced French painting, producing what is now called the School of Fontainebleau. This gallery in the Louvre is entirely given over to works of this school.
Courtly conventions of bodily grace and elegance dominate this Diana the Huntress, painted by an anonymous artist. Antoine Caron's Augustus and the Sibyl is filled with precise allusions, since it shows Catherine de Médicis surrounded by her court, watching a play in which the Sibyl tells the Emperor Augustus of a miracle, the birth of Christ. The scale of the figures and their attenuated forms, as well as the enigma of a play within a play, are elements that were bound to please courtiers of the period, who loved artificiality and intellectual refinement. The anonymous portrait of Gabrielle d'Estrées and her sister contains a toned-down eroticism, which the initiated will have no trouble in interpreting.
Queen Marie de Médicis built the Luxembourg Palace after Italian models. For her new residence, she commissioned Rubens, who had broken away from the Mannerist style, to paint a series of pictures of herself and her husband, Henry IV. The series now hangs in a room at the Louvre.
Figures once again take on monumental proportions in Rubens's Apotheosis of Henri IV. The same great source of energy that formed these figures keeps them in constant movement in this vast composition, which stands over 7 meters high. Today we sometimes find it difficult to appreciate such abundance of flesh and satin-like skin. executed in sweeping brushstrokes of transparent colour. No distinctions are made here. Still lifes are imbued with the same vitality as the allegorical figures which mingle unconcernedly with the real figures of Marie and Henri. There is, of course, an element of idealization, so as to set these personalities firmly on a historical pedestal. But Rubens has captured all sorts of real-life details in their bodies, faces, and gestures. The vitality of this court scene is equally in evidence in Rubens's Kermesse. Where ordinary life is depicted in realistic detail. But here an elliptical movement sweeps through the groups of villagers. It is Baroque art without the usual pomp. Rubens was often able to express himself totally in a sketch or a study, as in this portrait of his second wife, Hélène Fourmont. The brushwork is fluid and built up in layers of bright transparent colours over the brown monochrome of the preliminary sketch. Rubens's ease and joy in painting have long been a source of delight for other artists. Rubens may be compared to Renoir, not only for the sensation he gives of loving life, but also for having found a masterly technique for expressing it. One other sketch by Rubens, entitled Philippe Men. The still life has been vigorously constructed and conveys a near tangible sense of mass. In the finished picture of this subject, now in Madrid, Rubens had an assistant paint the still life. But here the hand of the master has touched it into vibrant splendor. Patronage by this time had been established as a royal tradition. Charles I of England was to become the greatest collector of his period. Van Dyck gave an aristocratic cast to what he had learned from working with Rubens. Charles I is in many ways the greatest of court portraits. Materials, particularly the satin jacket, are exquisitely rendered, while the picture's tonal values are held in a delicate balance. In his bearing, Charles is nobility itself.
The 17th century. The Galerie des Glaces at Versailles, where royal patronage reached its peak under Louis XIV, portrayed here by Rigaud. The court at Versailles outshone all others, becoming the model for the other monarchs of Europe. This is Chancellor Séguier, portrayed by Lebrun. Louis XIV set out to show French monarchy in the most splendid surroundings possible. His additions to the royal collection, his personal taste, and the taste of his courtiers still strongly characterize the present-day Louvre. Among the pictures which Louis inherited were two Raphaels, the Belle Jardinière and St. Michael slaying the dragon.
La Belle Jardinière. Under unevenly distributed light, the composition has been built up in the form of a triangle, with figures and landscape attributed their exact place in the scheme of things. Line has become freer, and the contours of the figures noticeably more fluid. As in Leonardo, gestures link one part of the composition to another, facilitating the eye's passage across the picture plane. The Virgin is shown 3/4 on, like the Mona Lisa. Ten years later, in 1518, Raphael painted St. Michael slaying the dragon. A whirlwind movement rises up through this large composition. St. Michael's body spirals upwards, ending in a wing where lines and colour blend in an abstract design. Louis XIV's personal preferences were not only for Correggio and Veronese, but also for Holbein, Dürer, and perhaps above all, for Titian. It is difficult to know whether to look at Titian's pastoral concert as an idyll or an allegory. But in its warm, golden atmosphere, one is particularly conscious of the masterly brushstrokes which leave the contours of forms unemphasized in order to draw attention to the effects of reflected light. The vision is pantheistic, embracing the whole of nature. And it is no doubt in this context that one should view the unexpected juxtaposition of the nude women with their clothed companions. Neither Rubens nor Poussin, nor of course Manet in his Déjeuner sur l'herbe, were ever to forget this vision. Titian's entombment has been conceived on a large scale, with its figures strongly contrasted against the emptiness of the landscape. Notice how the gestures form a diamond shape that acts as a frame round the body of Christ. To have left Christ's face in shadow was a daring innovation for the period. The evening sky casts a dramatic light on St. John's face, half hidden in shadow, and accentuates the whiteness of the winding sheet. Titian's achievement in creating so amply based a symmetry is dependent on his consummate skill in finding the most expressive means for conveying every detail in the picture. In Raphael's portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, all accessory details are omitted to give full attention to the face. The circular composition is closed at the top by Castiglione's headgear, and at the bottom by his clasped hands. However classical this portrait seems, Raphael would not have found such rich tones without the example of Venetian colour. In soberness, Titian's man with a glove might well in turn owe something to Raphael. The passages in white and black lead the eye directly to the sitter's face. Just as the sitter's hands are more open than in the Raphael portrait, so is the overall composition. The handling of the paint is controlled throughout, however, and in its sumptuous simplicity, the grey glove announces the art of Frans Hals and Rembrandt. Italian influence is immediately apparent in Albrecht Dürer's Self-Portrait with a Thistle, painted in 1494. The swift linearity of the whole, as well as the suppleness of the fingers and the precise outlines of the face, all put one in mind of Florentine art. The range of colour is sober, yet subtle, especially in the hair, the braiding, and the sleeve. The artist has left us with an unforgettable image of himself. Holbein's portrait of Erasmus is wonderfully lifelike, right down to the false modesty with which the great man lowers his eyes. For over 2 centuries, the art of Correggio held Europe in sway. Venus, the Satyr, and Cupid is characterized by an ever greater fluidity of line, and limbs so foreshortened they come close to caricature. The picture's soft light gives it a sensuality that enthralls generation after generation. The mystical marriage of St. Catherine celebrates the grace of women and children in an interplay of warm colour and soft shadow. We return to Venice in the second half of the 16th century and to Veronese's Supper at Emmaus. Veronese has placed Christ against a background of Palladian architecture and surrounded him by children and dogs at play. The luxuriousness of the setting is matched by the luxuriousness of the paint. The family portrayed on the right blends in quite naturally with this New Testament scene.
During Louis XIV's reign, aristocratic taste turned towards Rome, not only ancient Rome, but the city of the Renaissance and the emerging Baroque style. Artists from all over Europe congregated there because Rome was the center of new ideas in the arts, like Montparnasse in the 20s.
Painted around 1595, Caravaggio's fortune teller has the impact of a manifesto. The 25-year-old painter has chosen the most ordinary of subjects and set it in the street or in a tavern. People of that time would have been particularly shocked by the way the composition cuts its figures off at the waist. There is no attempt to please here. The paint is thin and smooth, and there is so little depth that the two torsos all but melt into the background. Yet the composition shows masterly assurance. The figures' round faces seem almost expressionless at first, but they are in fact psychologically highly accurate. There is no ambiguity whatsoever in their exchange of hopes and promises. The contrasted looks and gestures hint at what has just happened, and also at what is to come. Valentin's Concert, painted around 1625. A French artist who lived in Rome, Valentin has clearly been influenced by Caravaggio in his choice of a low-life subject, picturesque costumes and chiaroscuro. Yet Valentin strikes a wholly personal note in his fondness for bluish atmospheres broken by splashes of bright colour. The delicate network of nuances also gives way to areas of unbroken white, black, or yellow. A certain melancholic seriousness runs through the painting and makes one wonder whether the figures are altogether concentrated on what they are doing. They seem, in fact, to be elsewhere. Look at the child leaning on his elbow, surrounded by instruments. He appears quite far away, gazing beyond the drinkers, beyond the spectator even. The Plague of Asdod, painted by Poussin in 1630. Poussin's Rome has nothing in common with the cosmopolitan bohemian place portrayed by Caravaggio and his followers. The French artist had as keen a nostalgia for antiquity as the Renaissance artists. The Hebrews shown here, struck by the plague, are dressed exactly like Romans except for their turbans. The city of Asdod is ancient Rome as a man of the 17th century might have imagined it. This reconstructed scene has everything: fragments of sculpture, sober architecture, togas, tunics. one can feel Poussin's determination to impose his own style. There is none of Caravaggio and Valentin's love of the picturesque. Poussin's ambition was to recreate a grandeur of line and form, not to bring out local colour. This perfect world lacks colour, in fact, and air even as well. When he painted the inspiration of the poet, Poussin clearly borrowed his sky after the storm from the great Venetians. The three figures, the Muse, Apollo, and one assumes Virgil, are life-size. Apollo emerges from the shadows and the bright red drapery covering his thighs. Barely more than adolescent, the poet embodies the eternal youth of antiquity. Classical poetry is reborn in the form and colours, in the golden reflections on the lyre and Apollo's sandals. The setting sun throws its last rays on these majestic figures. Around the same date, 1630, Poussin turned to the tragic theme of Echo and Narcissus. Narcissus died from having looked too long at his own reflection and was changed into a flower. Here, in fact, we have the central theme of Baroque art, transformation from one state to another, of a man metamorphosed into a flower. Narcissus's body has been placed across the picture plane like that of Christ's in a Pietà. Echo, the nymph, has been turned to stone, and in the painting it is not clear whether her flesh is turning grey or whether the rock is taking on the pinkness of her body. The sky is Venetian once more, with a distant echo of Titian. Sunlight seems to flicker over the picture, like the flame in Cupid's hand. Diogenes Throwing His Bowl by Poussin. The philosopher realizes that even his bowl is superfluous once he has seen the boy cupping water in his hands. The two figures are in the heart of nature, which, in works by Poussin, is always inhabited. The tree by the water's edge forms an exact echo of Diogenes' vertical figure. The foreground is filled with stones and the bowl. Poussin was quite capable of imitating nature exactly, but he preferred an ordered vision, with strict outlines for his figures and landscapes, and a cold, precise light. A sense of order prevails. Right down to the water which faithfully reflects the overall symmetry. The tiny, far-off swimmers provide some sign of life in this stoical universe. From this self-portrait of around 1650, one can see that Poussin was a severe rather than an easy-going man. He presents himself as a painter, neither more nor less. And above all, with a painter's eye. Around him, one can see the attributes of his art, including a crowned woman, the allegorical figure that represents painting. The only decorative elements in this austere portrait are the canvases behind Poussin. In Poussin's view, history was not a matter of anecdote or significant detail, but a compression of time in which Christianity and the world of antiquity could at last be brought together. From time itself to a specific season, in this case spring, one of Poussin's later works where one can feel a growing coldness, with the pace of nature outstripping that of man. In Claude Lorrain's Fording the River, painted in 1648, landscape, nature and light reign supreme. The composition is made up of a succession of horizontal layers, an area of water, and a tongue of land with peak after peak leading from darkish brown to the bluish mauve of the horizon. The variations of light in the sky counterpoint the darker tones of the earth. In this painting, atmosphere is all, so that space and depth take on an almost tangible presence. Georges de la Tour appears to have worked throughout his life in Lorraine, where, inexplicably enough, the influence of Caravaggio reached him. In Joseph the Carpenter, candlelight gives him ample opportunity for displaying his skill at rendering form. Nevertheless, the luminosity has an otherworldly presence. The same luminosity pervades the adoration of the shepherds, but it has become softer, and the impression is correspondingly more realistic. A uniform regularity characterizes the faces and the clothes. Volume has been simplified to the point of abstraction. There are no cold tones in the chromatic range lit up by the flame. All emotion appears to have been suspended. Even the flame does not flicker in this unexpected stillness. Towards the end of his life, Georges de la Tour painted Saint Sebastian being cared for by Irene. With its vertical sections rising one above the other, the composition resembles the structure of a church organ. Because of the dark background, the picture appears to close in on itself. Looked at in one way, the whole structure can be broken down into a series of volumes picked out by the light. The figures are in fact no more than that. Not even the play of torchlight diminishes the fullness of the forms. It simply flows over them. While Irene's arms open in a gesture of unconditional charity, St. Sebastian's body emerges in a copper-coloured light from the painting's shadows. Stillness and silence reign. Simplicity and seriousness are the dominant traits of the early 17th century painter Louis Le Nain. In his peasant family, the composition consists of a straightforward horizontal, while the colours are basically limited to grey and beige. Even the fire is pale. The peasants have been accurately portrayed, including their careworn expressions. Village life remains Le Nain's subject in the smithy. But here the smith cuts a noble figure in front of the fire. Detail is exquisitely rendered through light touches of the brush. Daily life has been ennobled, and it needs no great leap of the imagination to see this village smith as Vulcan forging arms for the gods. Velasquez is not far away. Philippe de Champagne's Ex Voto, painted in 1622, infuses the portraits of these two women, his own daughter and the Mother Superior, with intense spirituality. The painter's obvious skill appears to have been held in check by a Christian sense of austerity.
For Holland, the 17th century brought not only independence, but considerable prosperity. During that time, the Dutch created a painting style so much their own that it was barely touched by outside influences.
Nevertheless, the Gypsy Girl by Frans Hals has a Caravagesque subject, a girl of the streets. But the style is eminently personal. The artist's rapid brushwork crushes tiny areas of white like snowflakes. Yet all the details of the face and dress are admirably conveyed through this flecked technique. The Dutch took the notion of painting everyday reality to its furthest point. In Ter Borch's reading lesson, a gentle light plays over the figures. The child's mop of hair lends the scene a humorous note. Peter de Hoogh has created a marvellous impression of space in his woman drinking by alternating broad bands of light and shadow. These different areas of space give rise to a sense of absolute immobility, which calls to mind the contemporary French artist Balthus. This brings us now to Vermeer's Lace Maker. The painting's format is like the page of a book, yet depth is suggested by means of a few lines. Within the work's perfect unity, a unique atmosphere prevails. Note the unusual angle Vermeer has chosen for his sitter's head. The composition is closed in on itself, absorbing a silence spun out of light. No painter was ever to come closer to the mystery of light. In this world apart, Rembrandt created his own universe. This is how he saw himself towards the end of his life in 1660. Gone is the fancy dress, the jewels and finery the artist liked to wear in the early self-portraits. Here he is shown at work, with his brushes and palette. His gaze is a steady questioning of himself and the world, and it emerges from the deep shadows of the background. Self-portraits are, by nature, introspective. This one combines age and darkness to become poignantly so. Rembrandt turned that questioning gaze on the scriptures throughout his life, painting scenes such as Christ at Emmaus and St. Matthew inspired by an angel. In the faint light of Christ at Emmaus, the rays around Jesus' head seem all the more significant. The colour pattern is mainly grey and beige, with one bright note of red in the Apostles' sleeves. The composition is deliberately off-centre, with Christ framed by the dark niche behind. The pigment has been applied in a succession of heavily loaded brushstrokes, then worked and reworked until the right depth and drama has been achieved within the forms. In St. Matthew as well, one is always conscious of how free Rembrandt's brushwork is, transforming a mass of near abstract marks into a book or a hand. One is also aware of Rembrandt's deep familiarity with the Bible, which comes through in the seriousness of the faces portrayed here. The same means are used in Bathsheba bathing, but to different ends. In his mature work, Rembrandt does not indicate where the light that bathes his picture comes from. Similarly, the depth of the composition does not stop at a wall, but is merged into shadow. In Bathsheba, light is concentrated on the naked body, the white linen, and the letter, while the rich coverlet gleams in the half-dark. One may well marvel at the way Rembrandt conjured up such glittering golds out of the sombre background. Once again, if one studies a small section, it turns out to be a completely abstract design. But by stepping back and looking at the picture as a whole, one finds everything fitting into place, including the dreamy expression of Bathsheba herself. Landscape was also greatly appreciated in 17th century Holland. Jacob Ruysdael's Sunlight, painted around 1660, is made up of swathes of shadow and light. A majestic procession of clouds moves off to the right of the sky, as well as to the left. Light glows beneath the picture's overall patterning of browns and greys. Space overflows into the wind, the air, the storm, and the sense of time passing. Nothing happens in this scene, so romantically close to nature that the Barbizon school painters Jules Dupré and Théodore Rousseau came back to a similar vision 2 centuries later.
Spain. The Escorial, King Philip II, Monastery Palace. In our choice of European paintings, Spain has been absent so far because Spanish painting did not gain an audience in France until the 19th century, when its unique qualities and innate violence began to be appreciated.
The violence of El Greco, for instance, in the crucifixion with 2 donors, in which the sky is rent in a way that echoes the twisted body of Christ. The dramatically contrasted colours, the blue-green sky and the patches of pure, blank, white flesh are more imagined than real. The figures are so attenuated as to seem expressionistic. And the perspective is drawn upwards to lead the eye to Christ's face. In Zurbaran's The Saint's Corpse Exposed, there is a distant echo of Caravaggio. Yet this simple composition, painted around 1629, is quite different, and centres on the expanse of white that fills the middle ground. The thick, smooth texture of the paint Zurbaran uses is of prime importance, since it creates the colour contrast between the white garment the saint wears and the embroidered cloth of gold. Stylistic boldness immediately sets this portrait of the Marquess del Carpio by Goya apart. Painted around 1793, it also shows how perfectly black and grey can be blended. Note how magnificently the shoe buckle and the mantilla have been painted. As Louis XIV's reign drew to a close in the early years of the 18th century, French society began to tire of the splendour and constraints of courtly life. Watteau captured this moment of change and nostalgia perfectly. The embarkation for the island of Cythera is more dream than reality. Gilles is similarly unreal, with its actor appearing off stage. The stage is in fact reality, and reality a stage. On the couples about to leave, Watteau casts an amber-coloured light and gentle colours accentuated now and then by dashes of black. The frailty of these figures is emphasised by the way their silk stockings and clothes cling to them. There is, of course, a strong hint of Rubens here, but transformed by Watteau's languid melancholy. The groups of figures are strewn in a kind of weightless garland across the landscape. They float in the picture's gilded light. Gilles is life-size. A strange figure, dressed in silvery satin, and ill at ease, both with his costume and with himself. He completely dominates the other players, who are cut off at the trunk. From the shadows, a figure with a ruff stares at us. He is accompanied, disconcertingly enough, by a beribboned donkey. Colours merge in an almost magical harmony here, both unreal and true. This is a picture that questions and gives no answers. In Chardin, one sees how attached French painting is to reality. This small canvas, still life with pipe, was painted around 1740 and has clearly been influenced by the artists of the North, then being rediscovered in France, and their skill in reproducing reality. However, everything has been thought out here and given its exact place for all eternity. The rich, creamy paint gives each grain of substance its exact note. Also by Chardin is this provider, a genre scene describing a moment in the daily round of a middle-class household. Because of the perfect harmony of light and tone that Chardin has achieved, however, the moment becomes everlasting. the artist spins figures and objects out of the same substance, light, in all its infinite nuances. But there was also a need for art to decorate the drawing rooms of aristocrats and financiers, and art to satisfy their taste, the decorative Rococo paintings of Boucher, in whose hands mythology provided a good excuse for nudes, as in Venus and Vulcan. By Fragonard, The Bolt, an openly erotic scene very much to the taste of the time. Yet it was painted in 1778, when the Ancien Régime's days were already numbered. One may detect a certain neoclassical influence in the deliberately flattened composition and the carefully ordered folds of the draperies. Greuze's famous painting, known by its French title, L'Accordé de Village, exemplifies another movement away from the Rococo, towards moralizing. The philosophy underlying this genre scene is that one need no longer portray gods or prophets in order to make the spectator think. But the real revolution was to erupt elsewhere, notably in David's Oath of the Horatii, painted in Rome in 1784. A revolution, certainly, but one that had been carefully thought out. Notice how David has deliberately avoided the billowing space of Boucher or Tiepolo and created a scene tightly contained within a massively classical architecture. The composition, with its distinctly separate groups of figures, reflects the clarity of David's aims when he planned the picture. There is a similar clarity in the sharp outlines of the figures, to which David has given a new range of colours. Form and colour are softer in the group of sorrowing women. A new era is about to begin with this picture. It is as if the artist had some foreknowledge of the other revolution that was about to get underway.
1789, the French Revolution. 1797, General Bonaparte, painted by David. (1804), the coronation of Emperor Napoleon, painted by David.
Ingres, portrait of Mademoiselle Rivière, painted in 1806, when the artist was a young man of 25. The color tones here have a sharpness, the sharpness of unripe fruit, that had been absent from painting for 5 centuries. A later portrait by Ingres, Monsieur Bertin, painted in 1832. The sitter was a prominent personality, editor of an influential newspaper. Ingres captured his character and social status through the lines and volumes of his portrait. The dark clothes and somber background bring out the lighter areas of the hands and face in dramatic contrast. The unbroken lines of the sitter's silhouette convey the strength of his personality and settle him firmly in his armchair. Another indication of Monsieur Bertin's power may be found in his claw-like hands. But this portrait tells us less about Ingres than his Bain Turc, which the artist painted in 1862 at the age of over 80. One of the artist's many variations on the theme of the female nude, the Bain Turc provides a marvelous pretext for the interplay of curves and flowing lines. Naked body and languorous gesture are repeated as if one were looking into a mirror. The mirror, in fact, of Ingres' dream. The blonde-haired odalisque, being tightly held by her friend, has the face of a Madonna by Raphael. All the facial expressions here are characterized by indifference, both to the dance being performed and to the artist himself. Everything, in fact, centers on the only truly important issue of how one curve echoes or contrasts with another. A few years after the fall of Napoleon's empire, Géricault produced his masterpiece, The Raft of the Medusa, based on a real event. This extremely modern idea was counterbalanced by Géricault's indebtedness to Michelangelo in the highly muscled structure of his figures. Romanticism came into being with this picture. A breath of new life, of new youth, was to transform the arts. Delacroix, born like Balzac and Victor Hugo at the turn of the 19th century, personified Romanticism. But there were two sides to his complex nature. One was deeply attached to tradition, to large-scale history paintings like Sardanapalus. The other was drawn to innovation, as in the Algerian women at home. In Sardanapalus, painted around 1828, the subject is the legend of an ancient Assyrian sovereign. Everything is in violent motion throughout this vast composition, above all, the twisting bodies which lead the eye to a pensive and immobile Sardanapalus, the self-absorbed instigator of the massacre. In terms of colour, the picture has a mass of white flowing into a great river of red. Violence comes through in Delacroix's organisation of the space, which is virtually tipped into the foreground. The influence of Rubens and even Tintoretto can be felt. When he comes to paint the women, Delacroix's brushwork becomes softer and more fluid. Sardanapalus is a dreamlike vision that deep reflection has disturbed. The sovereign himself is no longer present, while all the imagined luxury of the Orient has been put on display, and a curious sensuality courses through the massacred women. Algerian Women at Home, painted in 1834, is about light and colour creating space. One is also conscious of the very consistency of the paint, a freeness of technique that was to open the way not so much for the Impressionists, but for the Fauve. Outside France, Romanticism had taken various courses. As early as 1784, Fuseli had portrayed the guilt-ridden Lady Macbeth by combining a Germanic imagination with the Celtic myths of Britain, a mixture of Shakespeare and the Gothic novel. In Germany, meanwhile, Friedrich had painted his Tree with Crows around 1822. A tight handwriting characterizes this small composition. The neoclassical style was to lend a particular ascetic note to German Romanticism. For a century, this flight of crows was forgotten, since the Impressionists would not allow anything black to cross their skies. But their wings touched the imagination of surrealists like Max Ernst or Dali. dynasties of collectors, then generations of museum keepers, have been necessary to bring together all these images of the past for the visitor to the Louvre. Behind the works are the lives of men, the artists, who have crossed history and left us their vision, their idea of the world they lived in.